Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our final session for the afternoon. My name is Andrew Neil. The name of the session is What Does the Future Hold for the Euro? I suppose the Eurosceptics among you will think this is going to be a short session, but it may be more complicated than that. We have two of our country's top professional economists to address this issue and economic commentators. Patrick Minford, Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff University. Roger Bootle, the Managing Director of Capital Economics. You've no doubt seen them on television screens, read their newspaper articles, and so on. They're going to make some brief remarks to get the ball rolling, starting with Patrick and then Roger, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience so you can make your points. If it's a point you want to make, keep it short. And if you'd like to ask a question, then you can do so too. So let's go. Patrick, I think you've agreed to start.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. And I'm not sure if I agree with Roger on this or not, so we shall see. We haven't compared notes. What does the future hold for the euro? Well, I think the crisis has shown the fault lines in the Eurozone, and many people thought it had done very well for 10 years, and then we had this crisis. Now, the fault lines, I think, were known to us before it was put into operation. The first fault line is the whole question of what we call in this area the optimal currency area problem, which is another way of saying, can you run a macroeconomic policy of stabilizing the economy inside the Eurozone? And what a lot of people argued to start off with when the euro was launched was that this wouldn't be a problem because all the countries in it were sufficiently similar so that the European Central Bank could run a monetary policy, which is the main mechanism for trying to keep the economy under some sort of control. And there'll be no need for anyone else to have a different policy, no need for different central banks because they're all very similar. So the ECB could do a good job. I think what we've discovered is that isn't true, as many of us kind of said at the beginning. Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland desperately need separate policies. I think that's pretty clear. First of all, they always needed it, really, because they overheated quite a lot in the boom periods, particularly Ireland, but also the others. And they've been crushed in the downturn. And I think what they clearly need at the moment is what used to be called the standard IMF medicine, where you do a large-scale kind of monetary expansion, you devalue substantially, and you accompany it with fiscal tightening to get the budget under control. And what's happened is that they just simply have got fiscal tightening, and they're in very bad shape. So I think it's the first thing, that we've discovered that the Eurozone wasn't symmetric and has got very different countries in it which need very different policies. I think the second thing we've discovered is bailout. It was originally proposed by the founders of the Eurozone that there would be no bailout. In the Maastricht Treaty, it actually forbids bailout. And the idea was the Stability and Growth Pact, which is a way of restraining the various countries from running deficits, would stop any need for bailout. Of course, the practice has been we've had massive bailout, and we've got this huge fund being set up to lend countries money. And in addition, there's an emergency aid package that we've contributed to in the UK, which has been brought in on the basis of countries in the EU that are in difficulties, which seems a little odd in a way, since it's nothing to do with the EU as a whole, it's to do with the Eurozone. However, we have contributed, and there's that fund as well, which I think is about 80 billion euros, something like that. The other one's about 800 billion euros. So there's a lot of bailout going on, pretty clearly. And so what we've got is a real bailout crisis where the Germans are having to pay. They never intended to pay. Portugal, the so-called pigs, the Portuguese, everyone else, they need a bailout, and they're getting it. So there's a real crisis, of course, that many of us predicted would eventually happen. There's these fault lines. So these two fault lines have come up. So given these fault lines, well, what's going to happen? this is my kind of concluding minute, really. Well, this is the hardest minute I think I've ever had to speak for, actually.
Surely not.
And I've had some hard ones, I suppose. Well, I suppose that, there are, as usually there are, two main possibilities, I say rather pathetically here. I think number one possibility is kind of the world economy goes on recovering. Commodity prices don't cause too much of a problem. And gradually there's a recovery taking hold in the periphery of the Eurozone and things calm down. And the German et al. Bailout is successful in the sense that eventually they get their money back. In fact, in quite a lot of bailouts, people do get their money back. One of the things that's going to happen in this scenario is that a lot of the previous bondholders won't get their money back, and the Greeks are going to buy back their bonds, and of course they're at much lower prices in the market than their par value, and so that will be a way of kind of defaulting. They will borrow then money from the European fund to replace the money that they use buying their bonds. This would be a sort of de facto default. So that's scenario one. It kind of gradually calms down. There is a kind of default in the sense that existing bondholders lose money, but the main protagonists paying money through the fund get their money back. And of course, one of the reasons why this is attractive to Germany is that this way they avoid a big crisis for their banks, who've lent large amounts to these countries. So this is kind of the rosy scenario. The other scenario, of course, is that we get another twist in the crisis. The world economy has problems. Inflation takes hold, and the recovery slows down dramatically, and we get another crisis, and these countries then have to have a serious bankruptcy procedure. And at this point, the German taxpayer revolts and refuses to throw any more good money after bad. Well, obviously, under scenario one, the Eurozone survives. With a lot of regulation and bureaucracy, it seems the Germans are determined to bring in lots of regulation of all the participating countries and harmonization and all sorts of things that will be very bad for growth. But nevertheless, I think under that scenario it survives. Under the second scenario, of course, it splits up into a northern zone and a southern zone. Which of these will happen? Well, I looked in my crystal ball, and I came up with things going wrong. Well, periodically the world economy is a random walk. I like. Do you know what a random walk is, Andrew?
Sure do.
I could give you.
I do one every morning.
Yes, sort of drunken walk, and where the drunken world economy is going to go next is essentially unpredictable, and I think that's the sort of world we live in. But so I would put, if you look at drunken potential walks going forward, as they say in the IMF, I would say there's about a third chance of a nasty drunken walk, a lurch into the gutter. And probably, given that we've had a pretty nasty episode and things are now much more cautious and so forth, and there is a recovery going on, the chances of the scenario one, I think, which would be things muddling through, are probably rather higher, 2/3. So that's my kind of bottom line.
2/3 for a muddle.
2/3 for a muddle and the thing muddling through, and 1/3 for it splitting. Yeah.
Okay, Patrick, let me just ask a couple of questions. A broad one first. You said that when the Eurozone was set up, those behind it told us it was an optimal currency area, and many people told them that it wasn't. But wasn't the truth is that even the French and the Germans knew it wasn't an optimal currency area, but they went ahead anyway for political reasons? Well, according to the EU's official report backing the whole concept, it was an optimal currency area, or it wasn't a sufficiently non-optimal currency area to worry about. And there were a few politicians, I think, who thought there would be problems and welcomed it and they thought
they'd solve them by greater political union. But the official line of the EU was that it was,
even
it was
Greece.
okay. It
Even
was
Greece.
okay. It would be okay. I think that was the official line, and they had lots of simulations to prove it, which were mostly fraudulent.
Could you just explain again on the, well, of course they fiddled the figures to be able to get Italy and Greece in.
They did.
On your, what I might call the rosy scenario, at least the less disastrous scenario, explain, I didn't quite understand how the existing bondholders will end up with some default. Explain to me the mechanism. You're saying that say for Greece, let's take for Greece to be able to, when the existing bonds mature, it will then have to go and get more bonds from the ECB to use these to pay off the existing bondholders?
The plan is for them to buy their bonds back in the marketplace, where they're selling at discounts, quite big discounts at the moment.
Oh, I see. So if you're an existing bondholder in Greek debt, your debt is already at a discount in the marketplace.
So you buy it back. Effectively, this means that Greece will never pay it back at par. It'll just buy back these debts at discounted.
The central bank itself in Greece
Yes,
will
and then
buy
they
back.
will borrow from the fund to get the money to do this.
To do that. So in a sense, it's almost like a market-led default.
Yes, it means that the people in the market who already have got the discount will simply have it solidified in the form
And they'll take a hit on that.
They'll take a hit. So they won't get their money back.
Very interesting. Roger, it's your turn.
Yeah, thanks. Those of you who were here this morning will recall I made reference to Patrick Minford, and I said how difficult it was to disagree with him. And something like that anyway. And broadly speaking, I don't. In fact, so much so that I wonder why we were both asked. One of us I thought was supposed to be in there's a Europhile camp, and I'm not sure which one of us it is. I do largely agree with Patrick. Let me just make a few extra points. I think this was really a botched monetary union. The euro is a currency in search of a government. Now, it's not fair to say that the people who put the thing together at the time didn't fully realise this, because quite a few of them did. As Andrew was suggesting, the union was put forward mainly for political reasons. That's to say, there were quite a lot of people who thought, well, we want political union, it's very difficult to get it. We know that the euro ultimately needs a political union, but if we form the currency, there'll be crises, and out of the crises will come the movement towards political union. A lot of people actually believe that. I think that was one of the difficulties right from the start. They were underestimating the possibility for crisis to just go on being a crisis without actually being resolved through political union, although logically I think that what is needed is not just a currency union, but also a fiscal and political union. Secondly, there were major faults with the Maastricht Treaty itself, and Patrick's already alluded to some of them. There's also the fact, though, that the treaty made no reference to what was going on in the private sector. It's quite interesting that two of the peripheral economies that had gone badly wrong, that's to say Ireland and Spain, didn't at the time have significant fiscal problems. Actually, their debt-GDP ratio was very low. What went wrong was that faced with low Eurozone interest rates, with all the habits and past and traditions and structures that those economies had, this produced a mega boom in the property market, which then led to a collapse and a banking crisis from which Ireland and Spain are now reeling. So that aspect of the treaty was also, I think, fundamentally misconceived. Now, we are where we are, and what's the way forward? Well, since the euro was put together, I would judge that the impetus towards political union in Europe has faded. And this presents the European political class, I think, with a major problem. We know, of course, that in the upper echelons of the German establishment, they were always pretty dubious about Italy, and they were strongly negative about Greece. And everything that's happened since will, I think, reinforce those feelings. I wouldn't, though, underestimate the degree of commitment in the European establishment to the European project broadly conceived. And as far as German business is concerned, there's the added factor that the euro has actually done them a tremendous favour, in that if they hadn't had the euro, surely the Deutschmark would have gone soaring on the exchanges, and they would not have done as well as they have. But this is a very strong commitment, I think, to be set beside, on the other side of the account, the obvious and understandable anxiety about German taxpayers subsidising Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and so on. My view is that it's not going to be possible to put together a viable political union for all existing members of the Eurozone. And accordingly, I would put the probabilities a fair bit higher actually than Patrick, that there will be some sort of split. Now, the split may take the form, I guess, of some of the weaker members peeling off in an atmosphere of crisis. And okay, the problems with Greece and Portugal are going to be patched up in the near term, and they're fairly small economies, and there's not really that huge a problem. But the problems won't go away. They're not just about debt. As I showed in some of my slides this morning, they're also about competitiveness. And all the signs are that those economies are going to have to go through years, if not decades, of pain, depression and deflation. And I wonder how sustainable that is. So one possibility, I think, is that at some stage or other, one of those peripherals peels off, and that leads to a pressure with the others. But that would be, I think, a rather unfortunate solution. I think the best solution would indeed be for the Eurozone to split, for Germany to take with it its neighbours and satellites. I guess that would include the Netherlands. Belgium is a difficult case, but I guess we'll put Belgium in as well. Finland, I guess, as well. France, tricky position if, meantime, the southern euro includes Italy and Spain. What does France do? Perhaps France goes with Germany, so we get a rather strong northern euro and a weaker southern euro. I actually like the idea of the euro itself, legally and in substance, remaining the currency of the weaker southern belt, and the northern lot getting a completely new currency. Now, the beauty of that is that the weaker lot are still borrowing in the same currency, their own currency. They haven't got to go through the problems that exist of when you've got an existing commitment and what turn out to be a foreign currency, of the domestic value of that debt soaring. Could this come about? Is it likely? I don't know. I suspect that a messy solution is more likely. But I do think this is something that's going to run and run and run. I don't think the crisis is by any means over. These things take a long time to work their way through, but at some point or other, I expect to see German exasperation tipping over the edge, and we get some sort of shift. We either get a country or two peeling off, or we get Germany and her neighbours peeling off. I doubt very much, I don't think myself, that a central case is that we have the same membership in 10 years' time.
Thank you for that, Roger. Just a couple of questions there. The Maastricht criteria were meant to provide a discipline for the members of the Eurozone and laid down limits on both annual budget deficits and on debt to GDP ratios. Did nobody see at the time that where the discipline would be circumvented would be that countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal and even Italy could suddenly borrow in a very hard currency, and borrow to a degree that if they were still borrowing in drachma and lira and so on, they wouldn't have been able to do?
I think there have been people who saw that. I recall Alan Walters writing something along those lines. There were some people, but the prevailing view, don't forget this was at the time when it was widely believed, and I say this with some difficulty, an IEA function, it was widely believed that free markets always work perfectly, and there can't be such thing as bubbles and so on and so forth. Patrick probably still does believe that. I never did. So that you don't get these massive distortions in financial markets. We now, of course, know better.
Because that was where the discipline broke down, wasn't it? By being able to borrow in a currency that everybody thought was German-backed and trusted and a hard currency, they could borrow to a degree and at such a cheap rate that it would have been inconceivable beforehand.
I think that's absolutely right.
And the other question that I wanted to ask you is the German position. Isn't there a disconnect? There's a problem here between the German elite, including Mrs. Merkel, and the German people. The German people don't like the idea of bailing out the Club Med countries. And it doesn't help when Greece tells them they should just regard it as a form of war reparations, which is not terribly communautaire. On the other hand, as you've said, the euro has been incredibly successful for the Germans because their economies grew by, 4% last year? It's an export-led growth. The British government would probably sell Vince Cable to get that kind of, mind you probably wouldn't get much for that. But, so in a sense, the current situation has, although it's a hard sell to the German people, in economic terms, it's been hugely beneficial to Germany.
I think that's probably right so far, but you could imagine circumstances in which it wouldn't be. We have been dealing so far with crises affecting really only the tiddlers, that's to say Greece, Ireland, Portugal. We haven't yet seen the crisis, I think, play out fully with regard to Spain and Italy, and I'm worried about both those countries.
Well, I want to bring in the audience in a minute, but my final question to both of you, before I bring in the audience. Have we got microphones, by the way, or do you just shout? You have one microphone. Two? No expense spared by the IEA. The big fear only several months ago was contagion. That, I mean, we said it started with Greece. We then said Ireland would be next. We said Portugal would follow. And then, of course, Spain and Italy, the bigger ones, were looming in the background. You don't hear much about contagion now. Is the worst fear of that over, Patrick?
I think it is, because this huge fund, I think, is
stabilized
against the background of world recovery. You know, that's the thing, and the banking crisis kind of, you know, behind us to a large degree. I mean, the world grew very rapidly last year.
Indeed, 5%.
5%. So this is, and I mean, obviously, it's now coming up against commodity limits again, which I think was a big contributory factor to the previous problems. But I think that you know, now provided these countries don't get into a political mess with their fiscal adjustments because of high unemployment. I mean, this is a big problem. In Greece, there are now demonstrations and so forth.
Spain has massive unemployment.
Got enormous unemployment.
Italy's got lots of unemployment, unless you're a prostitute.
Whatever. The problem is that, I think Roger's alluded to it, there's the politics, the unpredictability of politics, both in the peripheral countries and in Germany, that could be the kind of the trigger for a crisis. However, you know, the traditions in these countries suggest that their elite have much more control than Roger is suggesting. I mean, it was, I forget who it was who said
political control.
Political control. I forget who it was. Was it Marx or was it Lenin who said that the Germans would never revolt because they'd all want to buy a ticket before they could, as it were, enter the revolution. And I mean, I think it's very unlikely that, obviously you get comments in Bild Zeitung and so forth which are very anarchic, but I don't think that that they are going to go against their elite on this. And I think the most likely outcome, frankly, is that there will be just an awful lot of regulation. And there will be a sort of political union, a political union of regulation. I mean, this is what the Germans have in mind, and the French. They want to regulate everything that moves.
Okay, I'm sure that'll come up before I go to contagion. You think it's probably still more of a major possibility?
Yes, I do. I mean, it amazes me the way the markets are so short-term. And before the Greek crisis, not just Greece, but the other peripheral economies were able to borrow in the markets at rates not very different from Germany. It was extraordinary. And yet the problem that we now recognise was there for all to see. They just chose to ignore it. And then we had Greece out of a clear blue sky. And actually at the time, if you recall, not that many people saw the knock-on effects to other countries. Then they emerged. So I suspect that this is a lull, actually. And Patrick's right, of course, in talking about emphasising the huge amounts of money that are being made available. That's going to make a big difference for a time. And I agree with him. I think that the world economy is very important here. If the world economy is very strong, then it's going to be easier. But if we were to have a relapse in the world economy, a lot of these strains would, I think, be much more serious. Yeah.
Over to you. Put your hands up. Let me see. There's a lady there. If we get a microphone to her. And a gentleman here. Let's get a microphone to him too so we can save some time. Let me know who you are and who you represent.
Natalie Merrins from Kleinwort Benson. It appears to me, and I might be very cynical here, but is this not all to do with German egg on the face and politics? Because ultimately the countries that are in the Eurozone were so fundamentally different to start with that it was always going to be the Germans that were the strong ones. There was never any doubt about that. And even if the weaker do peel off, then the Germans are going to look bad because they've bailed out countries that are no longer part of their union, and it all just becomes a weighing up of what is politically right and, you know, what is right for the other countries. Is that not just an impossible situation?
What do you mean as a result of that? What would happen?
What, as a result of what? As a result of peeling away? Well, I think it's a very, very difficult one to solve unless the Germans are prepared to sort of either say, right, we're going to bail out everyone and try and take control of it, which I think is impossible to do when you actually can't even get the right figures from certain companies about what's happening with their deficits. And alternatively, they accept that it's been a mistake and they sort of walk away. And for the German people, the German taxpayer, that's a very bitter pill to swallow.
Patrick, it's manageable for the Germans as long as it sticks to countries like Greece, Ireland and Portugal.
Yes, I think so. And I don't think Spain is going to need help.
You don't?
No. And not in the context of a world recovery. I think there is this competitiveness issue, which is the IMF medicine will be to devalue, to kick up competitiveness and get things rolling again. And obviously that would be a great help. It's not going to be there, so it'll have to be done through wage cuts and labour market reform and so forth, which is going to be very difficult, of course. But on the other hand, I mean, Spain has had 25% unemployment before and survived. Yes. So I think there's a lot of ruin in the nation, a lot of ruin in the European economy. As far as the Germans are concerned, their plan is they're not going to give any money. They want to get back the money that they've already committed, through these funds and so forth. And they are going to take tight control over future behavior. They're going to make the Stability and Growth Pact a really fearsome thing.
Are they going to make Athens send its budget to
yes, they're going to supervise everything. The Eurozone is going to become a highly supervisory body.
With the Germans above all.
With the Germans. And I think the Germans and the French really welcome this. They want to take control. And these other countries won't be able to do anything about it, really.
It becomes a bigger problem for the Germans if Spain and or Italy get dragged down as well.
Absolutely, and there's another dimension to this which you haven't referred to yet, and that's Germany's own budget position. Now, that's a lot better than many other countries in the Eurozone, but it ain't that great, actually. This ties in with what Patrick was saying about the world economy. But let's imagine a scenario in which the world economy does not do very well, and for whatever reason German export growth subsides, and Germany is growing below its potential so that the budget deficit is higher than it currently is and German debt is building up. In those circumstances, then does Germany say we're prepared to underwrite the borrowings and the banking systems of other countries? I think the answer is no. By contrast, if the world economy is strong, Germany performs well, she should be able to get her deficit down well, the debt ratios fall, she's then in a position to take on the weaker members and underwrite all that and so on. So I think that the overall economic situation is very important to this, but also the politics, and I think both you and Patrick mentioned the unpredictability of it. It's interesting. I think we're all guilty of talking about the French or the Germans, and this is, of course, in many ways an inaccurate description. I was very interested to see the new leader of the French National Front, what do we call her, Madame Le Pen? But anyway, Le Pen's daughter, talking about it might be in France's interest to leave the euro. This was one of the policy proposals that had to be investigated for the National Front. And who knows where all that could lead.
Gentleman here, before we hear from you, so let me see some more hands and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, a gentleman in the blue shirt and the reddish tie. Just there. Yes, sir.
Ben Patterson.
I think they'll look after you if you just keep talking.
Hello?
Yep.
Ben Patterson, CJA Consultants. I better explain, I used to be a member of the European Parliament when all this was being debated. And I think the reasons the Eurozone was created have not gone away. Now, the political thing was one, yes, the Franco-German agreement. But there were two very good economic reasons, and they're summed up in the phrase I think the Commission used, a single market needs a single currency. The creation of the single market was one stage, and the European central bank and setting up a central bank, a single currency, was meant to be stage 2 of the same thing. Now, the second economic reason was the failure of the EMS system. We took the lesson from that you had to have floating exchange rates, and that a fixed exchange rate regime was no good. They took the lesson that you can't have fixed exchange rates, you have to have a single currency. So those were the two economic logics behind it. Now, that logic hasn't gone away. If the Eurozone were to break up, the single market would follow on, and possibly also the political ambitions of France and Germany. Therefore, I agree with you. I think it's more than 2/3. I think it's more like 90% that it'll stay together.
All right, can I take that as a contribution and move on to another question? Yes, sir.
Carl Kilgan, Stanford School. I just wanted to ask, with inflationary pressures building in the Eurozone and perhaps the Germans wanting to raise interest rates through the ECB or putting pressure on the ECB to raise interest rates, what effect do you think that will have on this twin track of European development?
Well, Roger, are inflationary pressures building in the Eurozone? They're building in the United Kingdom, but we're not in the Eurozone.
Not yet.
Do you think we will be in your lifetime?
Well, Philip Stevens, was arguing in the FT the other day that we'd have been better off in the Eurozone.
I think you've just made my point. Will you? Do you think, I mean, every politician, even the most rabid Europhiles now, they never mention the euro to me.
No, I think that's right. On the inflationary pressures, they are building, but they're only in the same way that they are in most developed countries in the West because of the pressure on oil and commodity prices. I don't think inflation, apart from that, is likely to be any sort of problem. And if interest rates go up in the Eurozone from where we are, I don't think it would be appropriate at the moment, but I don't suppose they'll be going up very far. You can, though, imagine, I think, a scenario in which the German recovery continues very strongly, German unemployment falls, and indeed the Germans do think that it's in their best interest to cool things down a bit by higher interest rates, and yet you've got deflation, outright deflation in some peripheral countries, and that would be, I think, extremely uncomfortable.
Patrick, do you see a need to raise, I forget, what is the ECB administered rate? Ours is 0.5. What's the...
Well, it's difficult because there's an administered rate and there's the actual overnight money rate. The overnight money rate is very low. I think the administered rate is, 1%, but...
it's a little...
They're around about the same.
Do you see inflationary pressures in the Eurozone? And if the policy response to that is higher ECB rates, the consequences the gentleman asked for Club Med versus the North?
Well, inflation in the Eurozone is just over 2%, so it's really different from here. It's pushing up to 5%. And, a lot of that's due to the fact that our currencies dropped as a result partly of monetary policy, partly of the crisis. So it is a very different kettle of fish. I don't think the ECB is likely to move very fast or at all much on interest rates. I don't see this really as much of a problem.
It'd be pretty disastrous for the Club Med countries if there was a big
I think it would be absolutely horrific for them. Deflation is not a very comfortable position to be in. What's at the core of it is excessive debt and asset values that are wrong in relation to the fundamentals. And in those circumstances, the last thing you need is a higher rate of interest. I wonder if we could comment actually on the point the gentleman made there about the economic case for monetary union. I think he's absolutely right as a description of what happened. But I'm not sure the fundamental economics were right in the first place, and that I thought myself that the proponents of monetary union greatly exaggerated the potential economic benefits. They were persuaded that exchange rate variability was extremely damaging, whereas I think there's quite a lot of evidence that, okay, may not be good, but doesn't actually do that much harm. I think there was a great deal of confusion about this. Perhaps intentional confusion, talking up the potential economic benefits of monetary union. And it certainly was the case that those who propounded it at the time did argue that it wasn't just a political case, they argued it was going to bring economic benefits to the Eurozone, that it's going to enhance economic performance. Now, in fact, if you look at the economic performance of the Eurozone, it's very difficult to argue, I think, that their hopes have been borne out. It's not been a fantastic performance. It's not a cut and dried case because it's difficult to make comparisons, but you wouldn't say, looking at the Eurozone since the formation of the euro, that it's been a stunning economic success.
Now, can I add to that, actually, that in fact the main thing that the Eurozone made possible was this massive flow of capital out of the rich countries of Europe, Germany and France, into the housing markets of Spain, Ireland, and Portugal. And that, I think, is been a big disaster, actually. I mean, it's ironic that, you know, the opening up of capital markets had this extremely destabilizing effect. And I think it's because, unfortunately, these countries aren't very highly integrated. They really are not operating in at all integrated way. For example, the inflation rate in Spain and Portugal has been much higher than the inflation rate in Germany. So they haven't really acted as an integrated market, and this created these huge problems with competitiveness as well as the housing booms that have been completely inappropriate. So it's been unfortunately rather damaging, this capital integration. And the other thing that worries me about the whole European strategy has been they've accompanied this kind of notional single market with a very high degree of protection. And if you look at kind of non-tariff protection by the Eurozone, by European countries, it's been very high. And the other thing that I think is going on, in order to protect the euro, they're now going to go into this highly regulated club within a club, which I think is going to hugely damage growth and competition. Already you can hear the French licking their lips that, you know, they're going to stop competition from all sorts of countries in the Eurozone that have been quite inconvenient from their point of view. And the French don't really believe in competition, particularly from other countries. and now they're going to get their wish. So, I mean, unfortunately, the European Union is in a terrible mess. It's becoming more protectionist, more regulated, and in response to the crisis, it's going to get worse. And in fact, I completely agree with you. The result of the crisis is going to be that they're going to rip up an awful lot of the free market things that they put in place. And it's ironic, really. I think if they hadn't gone down this route of the single currency, we might have had quite a competitive Europe, you know, with a lot of countries kind of doing their thing quite successfully, you know, without these problems that we've now got. You know, Ireland would never have got this housing boom.
No.
Nor would Spain and Portugal.
Because they would have had higher interest rates.
They'd have had higher interest rates, and they wouldn't have had the capital flowing in from Germany. So I take your point, but I think actually the truth is probably the exact opposite of what these Euro kind of creators did. Had they been much more patient and made the single market genuinely work and gone for competition and allowed these countries to manage their own very separate economies, we'd probably be looking at a much more successful Europe. As it is, I think we're looking at a Europe that the UK is going to be wanting to distance itself from progressively in the coming decade, because it's a terrible mess.
Let's have some more questions from the floor. The gentleman there, if we can get a microphone. Any other? A monopoly of the front bench here. And the gentleman in the, you can show the microphone there. And the gentleman in the white shirt, if you just keep your hand up, we'll get a mic to you. Yes.
Philip Booth, IEA. I think you both neatly sidestepped Ireland when you were talking about how the euro might divide into two, north and south and all the rest of it. Ireland's interesting because it's a small open economy and subject to asymmetric shocks and all the rest of it, but hasn't really got the same sorts of problems that southern Europe has, but it has had a terrible time as a result of the banking crisis. And I just wondered what you think should happen to Ireland. Should it rejoin sterling, for example?
Well, there's certain political and historical reasons why I think that's not going to happen. And it's quite striking when you look at the weaker members of the Eurozone. They've all had their various political or economic reasons as to why at the time it seemed a jolly good thing to join. And that's going to be one of the forces which is going to hold them in. And in Ireland's case, I think it is the fear that where else do they go? They don't have a natural fit with the Club Med group. I think the sterling option, quite frankly, is a non-starter. So what would they be? Would they be a very small open economy with their own currency on the periphery of Europe? That would be, I think, they would feel that was quite a dangerous and exposed position to be in.
I remember at the time of the euro, the chief economist of the Bank of Ireland saying to me, as an economist, there is no case for Ireland joining the euro. As an Irishman, I'm fully in favour of it. And culturally, it was the final distancing. It was the final emergence of Ireland from its colonial past. And that's how the Irish saw it, and I don't think they would come back to sterling. Patrick?
No, it's true. They've had the most uncomfortable ride of any country. First they had interest at 7% when the euro started, and they had to reduce them to 3% overnight. And that economist you're talking about and the head of the Bank of Ireland wanted to leave the euro immediately. So they get control of monetary policy again. I don't think there's anything they can do because, as you said, all the alternatives are impossible.
Gentleman in the white shirt, on that cheery note for Dublin.
My comment is twofold. Firstly, it seems to me that the whole crisis, credit crisis, was originally driven by demographics and population explosion. And to a certain extent, a lot of the debt that we seem to forget about was flogged through these subprime debts back to the German public, who ended up with a whole load of rubbish that didn't pay them what they thought. And that was because they needed the high yields to carry on living in their affluent retirement. And I wondered, therefore, whether the panel wanted to comment on what the effects of the demographics moving forward from here on population have in respect of the euro, particularly given the observation made earlier that there won't be any Italians left in a few years' time.
We haven't, other than my sideswipe, we haven't really mentioned Italy at all.
I'm happy to have a go at that. I mean, I think I really don't agree with you at all about demographics because, after all, what does demographics mean? It means that people are living longer and they're healthier. And as far as I'm concerned, they should go on working. And the solution of these demographic problems is simply that people work longer. And why shouldn't they if they're healthy? You know, I mean, it's perfectly true. Another of the facets of European policy has been to go for early retirements. Highly inappropriate policy facing a demographic. But I take that's just a lunatic kind of momentary reaction. And mostly they're retreating from this. And I don't think there is a demographic problem. What there is demographics. But it isn't an economic problem per se.
Roger?
Well, I think there is potentially an economic problem that derives from the demographic profile in much of Europe. The fact that the German population is set to shrink quite considerably. It's not the result of people living longer that's the problem. It's the effect of this complete change in the age profile of the population with regard to the number of workers that are available, and similarly in Italy as well. But I don't agree with the questioner's premise that the credit crisis was fundamentally caused by demographic factors. I don't really see there was a strong demographic influence on the credit crisis. And after all, you had similar phenomena happening in different countries with very different demographic profiles. I mean, there's the point you made about, rich, aging societies, Germany supplying capital and so on, and that causing problems in southern Europe. But after all, where did the crisis start? Well, the answer was in America, which isn't one of these countries with population's growing and still young. No, the essence of the crisis was about a search for yield, bad banking structures, bad regulation, and bubble psychology. I think it had very little whatsoever to do with demographics.
Well, we could start on that topic, but that wouldn't be a good idea because I disagree
Certainly
totally.
wouldn't.
Oh, I disagree violently with Patrick on that.
But
this isn't about the crisis.
I knew I'd finally get you to disagree. Just sadly not on the topic we had to discuss.
Not on the topic, unfortunately.
It's almost 5 o'clock too, and I need to bring this to an end. Anyone like to ask a final question? Yes, lady in the front.
Bridget Rosewell, Volterra. I've got a scenario that I'd like some comment on, which adds another dimension to this, which is there's a huge amount of cash and capital being generated in the BRICS that we were hearing about earlier. Much of that then chases around the world looking for yield, looking for safe havens and places where the rule of law means they're not going to be expropriated. Much of it at the moment goes to the US, very large economy, but a certain disenchantment actually appearing around the world with the US and with the dollar. So there's a possibility, at any rate, that it chases into the euro. And indeed, there are now many funds looking for properties and companies and so on to buy in the Eurozone, which would strengthen that economy, strengthen the currency potentially quite significantly. So what does the panel think about such a scenario? And indeed, what would the consequences be if it were to come to pass?
Roger, isn't it? It's big happening in a way already. The Chinese are coming in to help the Portuguese and the Spanish, and because they want to keep the European market vibrant. They're putting their sovereign debt. So they're buying European sovereign debt now.
Yes, in fact, this tendency for the euro to be seen internationally as a favourable home for funds, both public and private, was there to a considerable degree before the Eurozone crisis. And it's interesting. I think the Eurozone crisis may well have caused the euro to be a fair bit weaker than it otherwise would have been. Now, at some point or other, if the Eurozone crisis is overcome and Patrick's vision or his majority vision proves to be more accurate than mine, I suspect Bridget's right that there would be, I think, a fair amount of upward pressure on the euro exchange rate. Of course, that does no favours to the Eurozone economy, and it makes the problem of adjustment in the periphery even worse.
I mean, the BRICS, the funds the BRICS have, they have a limited number of places to go, don't they?
Well, I mean, if what Bridget is talking about happened, it would be a big mercy for the world economy, because at the moment all the money is flowing into the East. And none of it is flowing really into the dollar area. In fact, or the Eurozone, basically what's happening is Western central banks are printing a load of money, and it's immediately rushing off to be invested in the Far East, in China and so on. China then buys it up because it doesn't want its currency to appreciate and prints a lot of money. And of course, there's a lot of money being printed in China and in India and all these other countries surrounding them that are trying to keep the dollar down, or to stop their currencies rising against the dollar, I should say. And so it would be very nice if the money started to flow back into the Western world. I'm a little skeptical of it because the way I see things happening is that the East is a magnet.
And much more so than we are in
much
Europe.
more so than we are, and it's creating this problem of world commodity price inflation. So we've got a world inflation that's fueled by Washington, and to some extent the ECB and ourselves through quantitative easing, because these other countries won't control their own money because they keep on buying these dollars, and that actually is the source of world inflation. It's perhaps the most worrying bit about the current world economy, because it is actually quite inflationary. There's quite a serious inflation at the world level, due to this central bank printing by the West that immediately goes east, where they then push it into their own economies.
Right, thank you for that. I'm going to bring it to an end now. We're going to hear some concluding remarks from Philip Booth, who's the editorial and program director. But as Philip makes his way, round of applause for our two panelists, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a very long and interesting day, and I don't wish to take more than 2 minutes of your time. However, I do wish to thank all the speakers and chairmen who have given very generously of their time today. Those who've been watching the news feeds will find that the message of our first speaker has already hit the news headlines in a pretty big way, and I'm sure you'll agree that the quality of debate and presentations has been very high. I'd like to thank also the IEA donors who have facilitated the attendance of our school teachers and students. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, and encourage you to visit our website. And perhaps finally I can just draw 3 things to your attention on our website. Firstly, the students amongst you might be interested in the minutes of our Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. We voted 5-4 for a rise in interest rates last month. And if any of you who are undergraduates are doing a project in whether 9 economists really can have 10 points of view, then you'll find your answer pretty rapidly in the minutes of the SMPC. Secondly, you can find our monographs and policy papers on our website, which provide concise and robust and rigorous free market economic policy research. And thirdly, we have a large number of free events at 2 Lord North Street at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The next 2, which will be in March, are on monetary policy, post the crash by a visiting lecturer from the United States, George Selgin, and then an interesting panel discussion on football, government intervention, the big society, and commercialism. So thank you again, and I hope to see you at IEA events in the future. Thank you.